if you want to say a few words.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I teach employment law, and I've written about discrimination cases in the context of union arbitration. Arbitration is one of my areas of specialty. I don't really have any prepared remarks. I mentioned at the hashtag #MeToo to hashtag #WhatNow symposium that there is an act pending in Congress right now, which is the Ending Forced Arbitration Act. And since that time, all 50 state attorney generals have signed on to a letter requesting that some type of act similar to that be passed.
Hi, I'm Professor Sweeney. I teach legal writing here at U of L. Some of my more recent scholarly work deals with street harassment and cyber harassment and freedom of expression claims around that. I also have done some work on rape shield laws and revenge porn laws. So that's where I'm focusing on, is kind of an intersection between feminist jurisprudence and technology.
My name is Dustin Meek. I am a 1991 graduate of the law school. It's really great to be back here in this classroom. I really literally started my legal education and my career sitting in that chair right there listening to Rick Noka in contracts class, and was enthralled and completely hooked. So my practice experience is in litigation. It's only litigation. I mainly represent defendants. I graduated and then went to work for a large law firm here in Louisville that's now Frost Brown Todd. It was then Brown Todd and Hayburn. I worked there for about 5 years as a baby lawyer, learning the ropes, spent a lot of time in the library, and then left with David and some other entrepreneurial focused litigators to form a boutique litigation practice. So I've been in a small firm setting since about 1995, managed a predecessor firm, and then David and I formed what's now called Tackle Meek in 2007. So my perspective here today will be from the private sector, as well as a woman and a feminist and somebody that cares very much about these issues and how they affect our communities.
All right, so now the floor is yours. So who has some questions for our panelists?
Okay, so I guess what's the biggest struggle you guys have faced as being working women in sometimes a male-dominated workplace?
Not sometimes. So I practiced I was actually an employment litigator for about 2 years. And I think that the thing I noticed the most was being kind of passed over for the better assignments, the more interesting work. Because, the younger male associates were getting along better with the partners. And so no one ever told me you're a bad lawyer or you can't do this or that. It just happened that I'm working on a case with this partner who would apologize when he swore in front of me, but not anybody else. Okay. And the younger associate was a year behind me, and he was getting to go travel with the partner to take depositions, and I'm filling out summons and subpoenas and stuff. So he was getting the better work, and because they would hang out. And I was not invited to do those things. So it was that kind of subtle stuff that I noticed most. I never had anything really in my face. So academia has been better, a lot better. So my best stories are really from being a lawyer, being an academic.
I'll comment on that same thing. It's different now than it was. Things have changed, and things have changed for the better, I believe. Personally, I consider myself very fortunate because I did have experiences as a young lawyer, and I didn't find myself confronted the way that you did on not having opportunities. I did have them. It doesn't mean, however, that my participation in those opportunities was different. It was different. When invited to go on overnight deposition trips or hearings with senior partners, I paused. I was married. I was newly married. I thought, how is my husband going to feel about me traveling with this person? On some occasions, when you travel alone, as I grew and I did things independently, I would be there with co-counsel, and the deposition would be over, and co-counsel would say, hey, do you want to have dinner? And you're there, and so you say, do I go to dinner with this person that I don't know very well, that's a man, and I'm sitting there in a nice restaurant, and we're talking professionally, and nothing ever occurred that I personally considered untoward or unwelcomed or anything like that, but I paused. And I think now women aren't pausing as much as they did because they realize it's my turn. I can be there. I should be there. I shouldn't worry about it. And the Mike Pence effect is really something that's troubling to me in this profession, because there are men, because of this movement, who will deliberately not invite women to go with them now on work opportunities, nor will they partner with them as junior associates or otherwise, because they don't want to take the risk. It's all about mitigating risk, and whether they admit it or not, they will make different decisions now.
So, for me, I think an interesting thing I found about myself personally is that if you just ask me, like, have you ever experienced sexism? My initial reaction is always like, not that bad, right? But then anytime I'm talking to a woman who's experienced something, whether she's been stalked, her pay has been unequal, whatever it is, I'm always like, oh, I can totally empathize. I had this happen to me when I was in your position, right? So I guess that's one thing I would say is I think I've faced a lot more gender discrimination than I necessarily acknowledge. And I know that when I'm talking with students or with other workers who are facing similar issues. And then something that I think, well, I could tell all kinds of stories, but I won't, but something that I think kind of illustrates perhaps the level of change is I practiced for about 7 years, and with one of the clients, and I won't mention names or anything like that, but just so you can get the image of it, they had been subject to a settlement agreement from the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces the sexual harassment and other anti-discrimination principles in the workplace. And part of that settlement was that those organizations would have to install women's bathrooms and would have to start using a rule that both sons and daughters of current workers, not only sons, would be hired, all right? So that's what I think of as plain, old-fashioned, outright discrimination. Now, by the time I was practicing, which would have been in the late 90s and early 2000, there were women's bathrooms, right? And women were in the workforce, but in much lower proportions than the men were still in this workforce. And as an attorney, I would have to go to a place where no women had made it in yet, so a place that was still all male leadership. And in this place, the walls were plastered with nude women doing all kinds of things and other obscene things, right? So that's not quite as bad as the outright, like, we're not going to give you a bathroom or hire you, right? But that's still pretty bad because no women go in there, and if they do, because they're the lawyer, that's what they're faced with, right? And so my hope is that today in that workplace, those things are not still posted there, and there may be a woman or two or three, but before they got there, there was probably one that left because she was probably pushed out, if not by explicit sexual harassment, by just the exclusionary types of things that Professor Sweeney has mentioned. And so I think there has been progress, but I feel that I still face gender discrimination every day.
like with the Me Too movement is, and partially like turning back on women and saying, well, you know, in order to prevent this, we're just not going to have anything to do with women whatsoever, and I worry that that can have a pretty negative effect on, you know, women wanting to share their stories, and also when you're already not being considered for promotions, partnerships, assignments that you like, that this Mike Pence effect will have such a negative effect. And so I was wondering if any of the three of you have particular like personal experiences with the Mike Pence effect and how you've dealt with it, or how you think it can be handled in a way that makes it less terrible.
Should we explain what the Mike Pence effect is?
Yeah, and that was a very shorthand way of basically explaining what we've seen with Mike Pence's statements, or what's been certainly attributed to him. I don't think I've actually seen him say the words, but he was reported to have said he doesn't ever dine with any women other than his wife in a one-on-one setting, or nor does he find himself or allow himself to be in the company of a woman without his wife. The idea there being that only his wife is allowed the company that he gives singularly focused. And that's really discouraging to women, because when that first came out, of course, the cry from the feminist community was, oh my gosh, how defeating. So you're saying women are not even allowed to be in a meeting with you, so how can they be secretaries of organizations and cabinet leaders and true policy advisors and your peer? If you won't meet with someone one-on-one because of their gender, you are not a peer, period. And that's very destructive. There's nothing we can do about that, right? So I think ultimately a way to combat that is be pretty aggressive and pretty cognizant of creating your opportunities. And that's easier said than done, but I can speak to it from a law firm setting. The larger law firms now, they have diversity committees, and they have institutional committee support and organization there that allows for female associates or LGBTQ associates or other non-white associates to participate in activities and opportunities that they otherwise haven't been able to do. At a small firm setting like I've been in for literally the last 22 years, that's going to be less formalized, but you really have to be the master of your own career. If you're in private practice, you're going to have to be your own, captain. You're going to try to have to navigate that as best you can, and having a mentor that you trust is really important. Be selective about that, but speak up. And most people here in Louisville, I will say, most firms that I'm aware of, they want to do the right thing. That's my experience, at least.
You talked about, especially like with bigger firms, I feel like the diversity, and that's like a really strong goal, and I think that's great. But you do still see, like, when it comes to like making partner, there's a little bit of a discrepancy, of course, between genders. But I'm also kind of curious about maybe your all's experience, or people you know's experience, as far as being a woman, being in the field, and the family aspect of things. So I know that our generation, I'm speaking like millennials, studies have shown that they're kind of waiting, and women, especially who are educated, are waiting to have families. But I'm just kind of curious about your all's takes on that in the legal field and where it's moving, and et cetera.
Can I say, just as to the Mike Pence effect, I think it's really important that men, so those of you who are in this room or who associate with men, that you let them know that that's pretty ridiculous. Like, women have served as law clerks. Most male judges hopefully aren't sexually harassing their law clerks like Judge Kaczynski was, and those are important relationships, and men need to be able to step up and have them. And then as to balancing family, work, and life, I wish I had a great answer for you. It's really hard. I have 2 boys. They're both in middle school now. I definitely waited until later to have children. But I also ended up transitioning out of private practice and into teaching by the time I had my second child. And a large part of that was because of needing that work-life balance. I still work really hard, and there was an author, I think at some point, that said it's not balanced. You're either doing work or you're doing kids, but it's really hard to do them both at the same time. So I don't have any secrets except to say that it can be done, but it's hard.
I think the that you drew the connection that's there, that women are not advancing as much in the legal profession and most professions because of the family obligations. And some of it is, stepping back to have kids, right? And that's part of it. But I think that's only a small part, because you can recover from taking time off. You shouldn't have to. It should be, completely accepted and encouraged. And I'm a big proponent of paternity leave as well as maternity leave, and everyone should take time to spend with a new family member. But I think part of the issue also is that once you have the family and you have the kids and you go back to work, I think there's still a huge disparity in what we call the mental load for men and women, and that women are still expected to run the household. And so it becomes increasingly impossible, even when you get back into work, because after you've had kids, to manage the household and to be a kick-ass attorney, because both of those require a lot of energy. And so you're basically competing for work and competing for a recognition with peers, male peers, who may have stay-at-home wives, who basically take care of all of that for them. And so they could just be at work when they're at work, and they're not managing a household on top of it. So, and I've seen female lawyers complain about this, that they especially their peers who have stay-at-home spouses don't understand what it's like to not have that luxury, and having to run, be in charge, somewhat in charge, even if the spouse is doing 50-50, which studies show they do not. But even if your husband does do 50-50, that's still 50% more work than a husband with a stay-at-home spouse has to do. And so it's harder. It's just harder. And I think a lot of women don't push themselves, they can't push themselves as hard on the career track because they're managing the household at home. Sometimes with a spouse that's not pulling their weight, and sometimes they are, but it doesn't matter. If both people are working, it's just harder. And I think that's a big reason why women are not getting to the higher echelons in a lot of cases. They tap out because they can't do everything, so they'll go to academia, or they'll, I did too, they will, decide to not try to make partner. They'll just be of counsel because they don't have to worry about that anymore, and they don't have to schmooze clients, and they can just do the work and not have to be out at all hours at events. And there's lots of calculations that women have to make when they're expected to run a house as well as have a career, a very demanding career.
Couldn't agree more with both of your all's comments. Dead on. I am a woman who have 3 sons. 2 stepsons when I married my husband. They were 3 and 5 when I married him at age 28. And at age 30, I had my son, who is now 21, and they all were very involved locally, very sports focused. I matriculated and made partner in 1998 at another firm. I cried a lot at night alone because I was exhausted. I knew I couldn't do it all. I knew that. I intellectually was bright enough, and I had insight enough that I knew that I could not do everything that I was trying to do. But what I figured out was I could do some part of what I was doing really, really well on certain days. So I could pick a day and be just hellfire lawyer and go home, and I was proud of myself, and I thought, you know, I'm a really good lawyer, and I killed it, and I was up here. But on that day, I didn't also feel like the greatest mom in the world. I felt like a pretty crappy mom. And then there were days where my calendar and my work schedule allowed me to be just the greatest mom ever. And I threw in, you know, as Sheryl Sandberg said, I leaned in and I became homeroom mom for one event, 1 year. And so I was a great mom for that occasion. But you cannot do it all. You just can't. And you'll struggle, and it's tough. But again, as I said to the Mike Pence thing, be honest. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with your peers, your coworkers. It's hard. You will be criticized for your decisions. You will be looked at as lesser than because you're trying to do it all and you can't do it all well. But ultimately, it was important enough for me to still be a lawyer because I love it, and to still be a mom because I love that too. And I was able to find, you know, sometimes in the dark of night, as I prayed to myself quietly, that little bit of balance that let me keep doing it. But it's not easy.
If you could change one thing about the way our legal system addresses or doesn't address sexual harassment and assault claims, what would that be and why?
So realistically, right now, that statute that I mentioned, which would end what we call mandatory arbitration in sexual harassment cases, because what happens right now is that many employment manuals and many employment agreements require employees to go to arbitration if they have any dispute with their employer. And what this does is it silences all the voices that we've been hearing over social media. So it doesn't mean if you end the mandatory arbitration that people can't mediate or arbitrate. They can, but the decision is made after the sexual harassment happens so that both parties are more informed. So in terms of something that can be done realistically, that is has an 8 to 9% chance, which is fairly high compared to most other bills of passing. Like I said, the 50 states' attorney generals all support some type of legislation like this. And then in terms of what I would really change, if I could just change anything, I think that, so when we talk about sexual harassment, I think I said earlier it has a severe or pervasive requirement for when you're being harassed by a group of people who are trying to keep you out, basically, of the workplace or keep you down, or, you know, their goal is to get you to leave, basically. So I think that severe or pervasive requirement has been very problematic because there have been judges that have found someone who's been groped twice. That's just not enough, right? 2 gropes, that's not severe, it's not pervasive, right? So I'm not quite sure how I would tinker with the law, but I think you would eliminate that. So it would be any time there was unwelcome sexual conduct that altered your conditions of work, regardless of whether it was severe or pervasive, you would have some kind of claim. And then I think employers, instead of just putting out policies that they could use as a legal defense, would be more on top of making sure that that conduct wasn't happening in their workplaces. That's my idea.
I'd transform the minds of judges and make them more feminist. And then they would interpret the law that exists better. That's, I mean, same thing, basically, that the standards for what is severe or pervasive, those sound fine, but the way it's been interpreted is, you know, if someone puts their hand down your shirt, it's cool. Just once, whatever. And that's not okay for me.
Professor Rusty.
I'm sorry, one of the things you said about arbitration and so on. I follow higher education policy a lot, and after recent events, higher education is really struggling about how to balance the interest. You all 3 have sons. Think how you'd feel if your son was wrongfully accused. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen very often, but it happened at Virginia and it happened at Duke. And when it happens, it's horrific for those individuals. And you say, well, it's been horrific for the women all these years. Well, I don't think the answer is you just trade who's horrific for. But I think what I tended to see at this conference I just attended is trying to make decision-making process much more quick and efficient. Because what happens now is it's all lined up to make it hard for you to make this complaint and make it take a really long time. And I think if we have processes, not that we don't want to have alternative dispute resolution, not that we don't, and I really do hesitate about having where you have to give up your right to be vocal about it. But we need to have process that's quick, and we can do that if we want to.
Yeah, also in the employment context, you have to first file with the EEOC and exhaust before you can go into court.
I will say, just from a perspective, because I mainly represent employers. I have been on the plaintiff side, and I have represented employee plaintiffs bringing employment claims. But employers are increasingly disfavoring arbitration, in my experience, at least here in Kentucky. The arbitration process sets up, in practice, more often than not, where a plaintiff is going to probably win something. Private arbitrators are more inclined to ultimately grant relief of some kind to a plaintiff than not. They just are. And like, with the employer defendant groups, they want to be able to appeal. They want to have a scrutinized opinion or decision that they can appeal to another court. They want to have due process explained. They want to have an exhaustion, a discussion of the evidence and standard of review. And they don't want their disputes to be relegated to one-line arbitration decisions that are rubber stamped, enforced by our courts of justice without additional levels of review. I agree that there's a problem with complainants having their stories squashed and losing their voice, because I think psychologically that's even more injury than perhaps what they've experienced already. But in effect, in practice, the employers really, in my experience, don't like arbitration as a whole. If it's a truly scandalous allegation and something that's going to get a lot of press and a lot of publicity, then sure, those employers are going to look to certain ways to keep the lid on it. But typical run-of-the-mill sort of allegations, they just don't.
So can I just intervene? I don't have the stats in front of me, but actually there's been 2 or 3 very recent studies, and the rates of arbitration included in employee handbooks is quite high, and the proportion of people in SPF 500 companies subject to them is even higher. So while it may be true, and it always has been true, that certain companies do not use them because they prefer to have summary judgment or they prefer to have an appeal, it is still quite a widespread practice.
Yes, fair enough.
Question about, when I was in Cub Scouts, they would do training about like what is appropriate, what's not. And when we start undergrad, they do that as well during orientation. With Larry Nassar, as well as a situation in Britain with a soccer coach, do you see maybe employers taking on a similar approach as to maybe the Scouts or universities, especially when I was at UBC, we had to go sit through a 2-hour sexual harassment training before we started in the Capitol building. Do you see employers starting some sort of similar type training that Boy Scouts or the Capitol building have been doing for a while?
Employers do have those types of training. Many employers do. The laws encourage those. There's a defense. Ellerth and Farragher are the case names. that encourage employers to have policies. So employers do have policies and they do have training. But an interesting thing that the EOC is doing right now is they're rolling out what they've called the respect training. And the respect training, instead of focusing on don't do this, don't grope women, don't, don't, focuses on like fostering respect in the workplace. And if you can foster respect between people, then you will have less issues, or the theory behind it is then you will have less issues. The other thing I would say to that is that right now, due to the Me Too movement, law firms that investigate sexual harassment are reporting a rise in requests from clients to come and rewrite policies, do investigations, this type of work. But I would say, I think some of those firms probably do a great job, and some of them are more focused on just defending any potential claims. So to that extent, you can get the EOC or the equivalent state agency to provide you training. So those are available.
I think for large companies, there's always been, at least for a long time, there's been trainings on these issues, and the question, I think, is what Professor Levinson was alluding to, is whether these trainings are adequate, whether they focus on the right things, and then whether the culture overrides. You can have all the training you want, but if it's just known like, oh, just sit through this thing, and then we can do whatever we want anyway, then the training isn't useful. So I think it's not, trainings are great, I think they're very useful if they're used right, but I think that the culture of the workplace needs to also be maintained and monitored, maybe even by the higher ups, to make sure that there aren't problems.
Yeah, I'm seeing some anti-bullying provisions in employer handbooks now, and those used to not be there. So it's pulling away from the gender-based differentiation or treatment and the sexual-based stuff, more just to be kind, be nice. It's now couched more in terms of power, and supervisors exerting power through bullying techniques, speech, activities, and employers are now writing against that, which is a good development.
Do you have a question?
So I just find it kind of inherently concerning that we have to teach grown men how to not sexually harass women. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on like how to combat that issue before these are adult men who don't know how to not sexually harass women.
My kid's 3, so I'm working on it for mine. Like, I'm starting small. But I do think this is good. The problem, I mean, this is like a whole other panel, all right? But basically the idea that, the patriarchy, rape culture, we can get into all these things that at a very young age, boys and girls are socialized to take on certain roles. And that can lead to what we call rape culture, and it can lead to boys and then men seeing women as objects and something to be used for their own gratification. And that is everywhere in society. It's in our media, it's in our movies, it's in our books, it's in everyday conversations. It is modeled for us by people in power and our own parents and grandparents. So we gotta dismantle that, and that's huge. So yes, have some boys and teach them better. And that's one piece. This social movement, I think women finally telling their stories. And it's not a perfect movement by any stretch. There's certainly gaps and things that need to be done better. But the idea that women weren't believed before, women have been talking about this for a long time, are whispering about it, right? Because no one wanted to hear it, and no one wanted to listen. So knowing more that we're even having this panel is an improvement. And I'll get them at adulthood if I don't get them as a kid, right? But obviously getting them, if we just have to change the entire culture of our country and the world, and then it'll be fine. So it's little steps, and it's, teaching boys. Yeah, I would love to see consent work, and I think some schools do it, where they talk about consent at really young ages, and I would love to see more of that. But it's, the influences are so pervasive, and it's such a multi-pronged problem that I can't tell you we just need to do this one thing and then it'll be fine, because that's not the case. So all we can do is try to attack it as many different points as we can and try to little by little change the way, the roles that we unconsciously inhabit. And it's going to be really hard. It's going to take a really, really long time because it's been this way. And it's improved over time. It's certainly better than it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 50, 100, you know, it used to be much worse. And so part of the problem is now it's kind of shoved to out of sight. And so it's not as obvious and so harder to detect, harder to define. So now we have to find other ways to get at what's left, I guess. That's my point.
Yeah, my sons are 28, 26, and 21. And they all grew up here in Louisville and went to all-boy Catholic high schools and went to various colleges, and they're far-flung now. None of them live here. But one thing that is very interesting about this movement is they all are talking about it. And we are talking about it as a family. And we have had discussions about it, very candid discussions. Thorough discussions. I mean, from the Aziz Ansari article about, you know, when do you have a bad date versus when does it go into something that's truly a crime or actionable or something. So those sorts of topics, because we are just there eating dinner, discussing it, that's progress in my mind. And as we continue to have those discussions around the dinner table with our sons and our brothers and hopefully our dads and uncles, then hopefully we'll see positive change, as you're saying.
Yeah, I think in terms of from the legal aspect, if you don't want men to sexually harass at work, then like I said earlier, you change the legal definition of harassment, and then even if they want to do that activity and their culture has prone them to do that activity, now it's not legal. But I think everybody here realizes law doesn't drive change, social movement drives change. And so then you're faced with this larger issue of getting men involved in the social movements that push change and that push change in the laws and that push change in the culture. My boys aren't too good. Like, they're exposed to all that stuff, and I found it really challenging to raise boys. My parents are bad role models. Like, you know, let's be realistic. Not like overall bad role models, but like they're great role models, like in general, but in terms of like sexist jokes or whatever, or the way their generation is, what the man does, and they're pretty progressive for their generation, but like what the man does, what the woman does, it's divided some certain way. The man works, the woman takes care of the kid, you know, like, and so like they're there and they're in my children's lives and they're role models for my children, just like they were for me. So I leave it to Professor Sweeney to change the world.
Thanks, Mom.
Start off with there's an old axiom that if you want to make an English bowman, you start with his grandfather, which I think you get a kick out of. What that means is, for the people scratching their heads going, why is he talking about archery? If you make it a generational project, as was alluded to earlier, what, if anything, could, if you happen to have a group, say, let's call it the American Constitutional Society, just hypothetically speaking, could that organization get in touch with, I don't know the names of the players, but get in touch with the folks who are in charge of education in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and say, hey, we've got a bunch of, you know, up-and-coming young lawyer wannabes who would love to get into your high schools and talk to your boys and girls about consent. Before they get to dating age, before they've seen one too many, you know, Conan the Barbarian movies where, you know, women are nothing but sexual objects. Because you're absolutely right, we have a terrible culture that promulgates the use and abuse of women. The way to, and I hate to draw a parallel to this, but it seems to fit. Somewhere, probably in this state as well, but up in Indiana and down in the hollows of Alabama, there are Klansmen who genuinely believe in a truly outdated system that one kind of individual is superior to another. This isn't that different. And the reason I mentioned the Klansmen, you're not going to educate those folks now. it's too late for them. There cannot, I mean, is
Yeah.
it possible?
It's-
Sure. Is it likely? No. You have to wait for that generation to die. Now, I know, that's a terrible thing to say, but
I'm okay with Klansmen dying.
I am too, for the record, but
That's fine.
the point is, if we start immediately with this crop of school kids right now, and that's gonna be an uphill fight to get that information into the classroom, I get it. But that's where you start your change. So why don't we do something about it?
Well, to answer your specific question, I do think there's a path into getting into JCPS.
Okay.
And that we should talk, we should talk about it.
Okay.
Because I know some organizations have succeeded in getting their programs before schools. So there's a path that
Okay.
can be taken. So it's, that part's doable, yes, that's the easy thing. And the other thing, yes, that's all I have for the rest of your question. So just-
Sarah, I think I saw yours.
Just, this is kind of a comment, and I wanted your feedback on it. So say for instance, there were two individuals, a man and a woman, and they went to a port call as military members. Both individuals get drugged while they're in port call. Both individuals get separated from one another. The man and the woman both experience the same events. They both wake up with strange folks and not in clothing. When they both return to the ship, or whomever they might belong to, the gentleman tells the story that, oh, he had such a great night, he got drugged, oh my God, and all this story, oh my God, can you believe I woke up in my underwear? And he was violated the same way that the woman was. He just had to take a different direction to deal with it. And I think, and of course, you know, the woman's reaction is generally what a woman's reaction would always be. Well,
Generally.
right. So I think part of the story that's getting missed is that I don't think that men, when they go into the locker room, necessarily want to get their private parts grabbed either. By other men or anybody. So not to say that the struggles are the same. Okay, fantastic. Generally, not to say the struggles are the same, but I think that's a component of the story that's missing in our general culture.
That's the problem with the patriarchy, right? Is that
Right.
it just is a disservice to both
More about
genders, right?
roles
That
than
it,
it is the
yeah,
actual
when you're forced into a role,
Right.
men they're not allowed to express emotion. You're not allowed to take on a more nurturing role if you wanted to. You know, you're put in a box too. Men are put in a box just like women are put into a box. I would argue the women's box sucks more, but it's still a box for both, and it's a problem. And dismantling the toxic masculinity and rape culture and the patriarchy and all those things would benefit both genders. And I do think that right now it's women's voices that are being put forward more. And partially it's because no one was listening before, and so this is this version. But I agree with you 100% that this other piece needs to be added to it. And there are some scholars that this is what they talk about, and there's some parts of feminism that talk about the toxic masculinity and things like that. And I agree that should be part of our discourse when we talk about the dangers of the culture that we're in and how it's very harmful to men as well as women. That's absolutely right.
And I would just say that in terms of the law of sexual harassment, you can be a man, and if you're harassed because of your gender, you have a legal claim to the same extent a woman who's harassed because of her gender does, and the Supreme Court has explicitly so held. And like, if you're being harassed because of your race, you have a claim. That's still not sexual harassment, but that is still a form of discrimination that's recognized by the law, subject to all the same barriers we've already discussed.
Yeah, to your point, I'll tell this is anecdotal, but I was doing some research and I was looking for articles or information informing the legal community what has changed. If you're a litigator and you're out there and you're trying sexual harassment cases or you're dealing with these types of claims, what has the Me Too movement done either with the courts or with jury pools, or how is it manifesting? What are the results? And an attorney told of an experience where he was trying a sexual harassment case, and in voir dire, he stands up, as is typical when he goes through his voir dire. Into the pool, he poses the question, how many of you have experienced it in what you believe to be sexual harassment? And he said, typically he would get 2 to 3 hands, you know, sort of reluctantly sort of coming up. Most recently, he had a trial, and he had almost 2/3 of his voir dire pool raise their hands. And it was like gasp in the courtroom, like, wow. And as he went through, as you do in voir dire, and you take and identify certain of your pool members and say, juror number 122, let me ask you, would you share your experience, et cetera? Do you have any strong held beliefs and opinions that will affect your ability to be impartial, blah, 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 and all the legal speak? A gentleman raised his hand. He asked this man, and the man said in front of everyone, I have been a victim of sexual harassment, and I've never told anyone until right now. And he started crying. And that's a movement. I mean, when you have that stuff happening, to your point about how do the men feel, and men can be victimized as well, and this movement is good for men too. That is empirical evidence that is true.
Any other questions? Awesome.
So the list is probably endless, but when you were talking about, big P patriarchy and big T M toxic masculinity and all these things that can sound sort of nebulous, I start to think that I have like a little cousin who her mom is saying, if you don't want to give a hug to Uncle insert whomever, you don't have to give a hug to Uncle insert whomever. Like, this is what consent means. She's 5. So that's, one instance that I can think of just completely innocent background of rape culture, which is you have to hug your family members. So I was wondering if you could give other concrete examples of things that don't seem like they're having a big effect on somebody who eventually would like to be a parent, that I can just be like, oh crap, I don't want to teach my kids that they have to hug Uncle insert whomever. So just what are some concrete examples of these kinds of abstract notions of rape culture that we can be focusing on for teaching the next generation? Boys
will be boys. He's just doing that because he likes you, kind of stuff. That's huge. And it's, if that's your kid, if your son is, someone says, believe the girl and tell your kid, your son to knock it off. But yeah, the big one is, he just ignore them, boys can't, this idea that boys can't help themselves. The other part is, what's coming out a lot more recently is like the dress code stuff happening in schools where girls are getting sent home because their clothes are distracting to boys because their shoulders are showing or something. And so, which is sending the message that boys' education, first of all, boys can't control themselves. And second, that their education is more important than your education. It's more important that they're not distracted than you actually get to be in class today because we're sending you home for what you're wearing. So those are messages. But as a parent, I think the big one is, dismantling this, boys will be boys and they're just high-spirited and they don't mean it. And the worst one is, it's because he likes you. That's why he's, pulling your hair and messing with you and touching you when you don't want to be touched. And that will probably be the biggest one I would love to stomp into the ground.
So I think there's similar things too with girls. Like a lot of times when we look at babies, we're like, oh, she's so cute, what a pretty baby, right? And we comment on like her clothing. So to the extent you're dealing with younger girls, that you can comment on how they're smart, how they're observant, strong, flexible, like all the things that we don't usually say that also apply. And then like with my kids, something I do that I feel like my parents' generation didn't do is like if they're going overnight somewhere, I like remind them like you don't have to be alone with an adult. They, nobody should be touching you inappropriately. I think if they're boys or girls, letting them know that it's not your parents' generation who you're gonna go away and be harassed by your pastor and they're never gonna hear about it, right? Like, that you care and that it's not okay.
I guess I'm just looking for some general advice. And I'm really thinking about like a specific instance where I encountered behavior that I was uncomfortable with, and I approached this person and was like trying to talk to them about it, and it was like dismissed as like they were just joking, like they just laughed about it, and I didn't know what to do. Like, what should I do? Like, just cut off that relationship because I don't want to do that, but then I also want to educate them about what's appropriate and what's not. And I just didn't know what to do. So, do you have any general advice on how
It's
to
not your job to
that?
educate somebody, by the way. I give you full permission to cut them out of your life, and it's not your responsibility to make sure that every man you
I'm
encounter.
gonna interject a little bit here. I would wanna know more information. Did they stop doing that? Because, and sometimes people are embarrassed or uncomfortable, so they wanna laugh it off, and they change their behavior. So that would make a difference to me about whether I'd cut them off or not, so.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I was gonna, did they seem open when you said, I didn't like that? But when you say that they laughed and said I was just joking, they were deflecting. So but my ultimate answer is it's up to you whether you want to keep that person in your life, but with boundaries. If you want to distance yourself, if you want to downgrade them from friend to acquaintance, you have all the options here. But my whole point is because you seem like you feel guilty about cutting someone out, and you should not. Because it is not your responsibility as a woman to make sure every man you encounter is a feminist. Because that's, first of all, you don't have the power to do that. And second, you need to look out for yourself too, right? So it's not your job to make it, you don't have the ability to make that guy not do that again, right? You did what you could, and if you want to keep them in because you think they're salvageable, that's fine. But it's not because you're gonna magically transform them with the power of your awesomeness. Because you can't. So do it for you and what's good for you in your life. But if this guy goes on to do it again, that's not your fault or your responsibility. And that's what I was hearing in what you were saying. Okay. So, up to you.
Anything else? Okay, Sophia?
I just, I don't know, I've been kind of struggling with how to bring this up, but I think when we're talking about this movement, what a lot of times isn't talked about or brought light to is how the experiences of white women is going to be completely different from women of color. And we're not seeing these women brought up into these spaces. That is problematic because it's just the experience is going to be completely different, and it's not being intersectional to the point where it needs to be. So for it to truly be this movement that people want it to be, we need to realize our privileges, and then as well as how the space isn't totally inclusive.
Great. Sorry, I keep talking a lot. But basically, I agree with you, and I think that the Me Too movement, one of the, I think, fair criticisms is that it was started by white women. And white women have more privilege and power than women of color. We still have, the gender problem, but we do have privilege of our race. So I do think it's the white women that started this that need to carve out spaces to let other voices come up and need to be proactive about it. Because I absolutely agree with you. It's, I think it's moving in that direction slowly. For example, the Women's March this year was way more conscious of including, especially the one here in Louisville. They had speakers of color, and they're very conscious about making sure that those voices were included because we're so, white women were so like, yeah, gender, that we forgot everything else, which is short-sighted, well-intentioned but short-sighted, and hopefully gets corrected.
I think a lot of times is that misunderstanding of, or lack of knowledge as to what intersectionality is.
Yes.
And I don't think that you can truly be feminist if you're not being intersectional.
I would agree with you. And it's problematic to, I think people, when they feel oppressed because of one aspect of their identity, don't like it when someone say, but you do have privilege in this other aspect, because they don't feel privileged. So you see that with men, especially like class, right? If you're poor, a poor white male, you're like, I don't have any privilege. Like, well, you need to see what your privileges are. So I think white women were so, overwhelmed with, oh my God, I can finally talk about all these ways I have been oppressed, weren't paying attention. And they can't see because you don't live it, it's hard to see that. And it's hard to, and if you don't have those experiences, it's hard to even know that there's something missing. So I do think that women of color have been doing a really good job of raising the issue and saying you're not being inclusive, and hopefully the women that are being accused of this will open to it and listen and not get defensive, because it is a criticism, but it's a constructive one. And so I have seen evidence that it is penetrating, but I agree a lot more work. And I agree with you also that, you know, intersectionality is huge. You need to be aware of the ways many different groups of people are pushed down in society, and not just the ones that directly affect you. Okay.
Yeah, and I would say I think it's also a problem with the law, because even under the anti-discrimination principles, it's like you're discriminated because of your race, or you're discriminated because of your gender, or you're discriminated because of your religion.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, it's like all mixed together, like they have a different race, a different religion, different gender, and that's all part of why people are trying to exclude them from the workforce. And then another just interesting thing, I guess, recently I went to see Dolores, the movie At the Speed, which is about Dolores Huertas, who organized the farm workers with Cesar Chavez. And part of the movie was about her relationship with Gloria Steinem, and how at first she felt like, you know, you have the white traditional feminist and somebody who's working with very low socioeconomic, which is often overlooked as well, Latina people in the farm area, but they ended up realizing that they could mobilize many more people in support of both of their causes if they understood that intersectionality. So I think there are good examples out there of feminists. And ultimately, Dolores Huertas today, she will say she's a feminist, whereas she would not have said that, you know, 20 years ago. So.
Thank you so much for raising that point. And I recognize that people in positions like myself who plan these events have a responsibility to represent diverse voices and to be intersectional. And I do apologize that there are not people of color represented here today. It's very important. And so I speak for the ACS when I say that we're going to get better. And thank you for raising that, because I know it can be really hard to do that. So thank you. I'm being signaled that we need to wind down. I think there might be more questions, so if you have time after, come to me and we can construct an email thread if you all would be okay with that, and we can get everyone onto an email and continue this dialogue. Unfortunately, we just are about out of time, if not already. One last thing that I want to mention is we have these hashtags here, and a big thing that this month has been going on here at Brandeis is we've been having these conversations. Professor Rothstein had an event, and then your event that you had. It's been really, really great. But we don't want that to just end when we walk out of this door. So kind of to symbolically show solidarity and to like memorialize the great events that we've had, we have these hashtags that we're going to have posted around the school, and you can also come get them from me, Zach, or David. And if you would just write a personal story, something that your sister or mom or brother has experienced, or something that you fear, or something that you're proud of in regards to sexual harassment and assault in the law, please do. Not even in the law, but you know, just as kind of sisters and brothers in this movement, it would be really great to see that. And then when you're done doing that, you can slide it under the ACS office door, and that office is literally right downstairs where we are right now, and you'll see on the door like some postings of ACS, so you'll know it's us. But just do that, and then we're going to keep them posted on the door to just not forget this. And you know, personally, I'll get to see it every week when I'm down there, and that's really important to us as well. So if you have time, just share a narrative, even if it didn't happen personally to you. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. This was so thoughtful. Like I said, if you have more questions, we'll get an email thread going, and our panelists are so gracious. I'm sure they'll find some time to communicate with you further. But is there any?
I actually wanted to talk about an event that's happening Thursday evening. It's also a Me Too event. It's going to be at Headliners, and it's a storytelling event based on Me Too stories, and we have it's a local theater company I'm involved with that put together a group of really good storytellers. They also have an online portal where people could submit stories that will be read and then people on the night can actually write down stories. But to get to Sophia's point, they actually made a conscious effort to make sure that there were people of different groups and a substantial showing from people of color. And and we've had a rehearsal and it was amazing. So it was going to be a really, really powerful, good event. Angela Renfro is one of the people, and Amy Leonard's from 2 organizations here that deal with abuse and human trafficking. And so if you want to keep doing these things, want to continue the conversation, want to learn more, want to hear more stories, then this event, it's called We Became the Story. I have a poster up on the main bulletin board in the law school, and it's headliners 7 o'clock, $12 in, and 18 and older if you want to bring younger siblings.
Alexis, can I say one other?
Please.
I just think it takes a lot of courage to be doing what you all are doing. Not only getting your educations, but trying to live your values and continue in whether it's social justice issues or whatever issues. And I really do want to send the message that there are others of us older than you who care about those things. Dustin is one of the bar examiners in Kentucky. And there's no greater source of authority I can suggest for that. So I'm proud to be your partner, but this is an indication that the bar does support progressive views, and just want to make it known that.
Thank you. Any final thoughts from y'all? Okay, everyone, thank you so much. Yeah, let's give them a round.